Our first speaker will have a dialogue. There won't be a succession of speeches, but the first person who is going to talk, Mie Clarence Smith, who is currently doing a doctorate at the University of Sussex, but more relevantly for what we are going to talk about in a minute, she is a native of a place called Auroville. Auroville is a community of about 3,000 people that has been created in 1968, hence the connection with hippies, 1968 in Tamil Nadu. And part of what we are going to talk about is then, at the beginning, is then the difference between the institutions in Auroville, difference and also similarities with the idea of a society with basic income. So we'll be starting with that, but then I'm already introducing then the other two partners in this conversation. Stuart White has already been presented to you, is like me, a political philosopher. He's teaching at Oxford, and I must say that he started in the book based on his doctorate. He started with a position that was not that sympathetic to basic income. And then at one of the early congresses of Bien, in which he participated, he had this very surprising paper and memorable paper that was called Reciprocity Arguments for Basic Income. And since then, he's been a regular, very articulate contributor to the discussion of basic income. And then finally, Yo-Sang An used to be the leader of a small party, then called the Socialist Party in Korea. It's a party that had put basic income on its platform. He's a historian by training and teaches part-time in one of the Seoul universities. He's also the general manager or somehow, whatever it's called, the boss of the Korean Basic Income Network. So the first question then, with which we are going to start, is and with a presentation by Surya Mie, which will be then, what are exactly then some aspects of the institutions of Auroville? In what respect are they similar? In what respect do they differ from what would be a basic income-based community?
Hello. I'd like to first of all start by thanking Sharath for inviting myself and other Aurovillians to participate in this conference, for us to learn more about basic income and how it might be relevant for our community, as well as what the enacted practice of our community might contribute to the basic income debate. So I first met Sharath last year when he accepted my invitation to Auroville's 50th anniversary conference, in which we really sought to actually link up these experiments that we've been doing in our community with progressive research and practices in various fields around the world. And several Aurovillians had already picked up on this potential for mutual learning with basic income, and I'm very happy to say that Sharath left feeling that, yes, there is also really a basis for continued exchange. So thank you very much for having us. And this exchange has been ongoing, actually, because Hilda Latour came to Auroville just before this conference, and several of you are coming afterwards. So please, if you'd like to join them, do join us. You're welcome there, and let's keep this collaboration going. Just to give you all a little bit of context before I dive into the question of how does Auroville relate to basic income specifically. So Philippe already mentioned some very basic. So Auroville was founded in 1968. It's an intentional international community of about 3,000 people on about 20 square kilometers. And 50% of the population of Auroville is Indian. The philosophical basis of this community is the yogic philosophy and practice of a very celebrated Indian philosopher named Sri Aurobindo, who first came to fame and recognition in India because of his involvement in India's independence movement. So that's how a lot of Indians first came to know him, was actually as a political revolutionary. And later on in his life, he actually turned to yoga and to spirituality because, in his words, I mean, he realized that in order to actually achieve the emancipation that India wished to achieve, it could not only be political. There had to be a much deeper, a much more what he called integral exercise, really, of what does it mean to be an emancipated nation, an emancipated society. And for him, he drew a lot on India's yoga tradition in order to explore that. Unlike many understandings of spirituality, or what is a spiritual life, or what is a spiritual practice, which really relegates spirituality very much to the private sphere. And we had a bit of these discussions in the first plenary on religious and secular perspectives on basic income. Can it be in the public sphere or not? Sri Aurobindo's conception of spirituality was actually that, and of an evolution, of a spiritual evolution of society, was that spirituality should be brought into all aspects of life, should actually inform all aspects of society in order for these to be transformed and to become more conscious, more emancipatory. And Orville was founded as a community, in a way dedicated to experimenting with this. So how can we experiment with creating an alternative, intentional community that seeks to elaborate a whole society, so a very, secular life, as many of us know it, but that's inspired by the spiritual foundation. And so unlike many spiritual communities, Orville has a very wide range of activities. It has its own businesses, enterprises, it has its own schools, it has its own cultural institutions, it has research institutions. So it's really like any kind of township that you could imagine. Since its founding, Orville has been recognized and endorsed, supported, including financially, by the government of India. And it is today a registered foundation under the Human Resources Ministry, which was formerly the Education Ministry of the Central Indian government. And it also has been recognized since its inception by UNESCO. And I mention this because in the whole history of intentional communities, which I don't have the time to delve into today, a lot of these have been very marginal communities. So I think it's interesting to see this level of recognition in terms of a project of society. So Orville was largely founded as kind of with an anarchic conception of what it would mean to elaborate a spiritualized society. But its founder, who was a close collaborator of Sri Aurobindo and who never lived in the community, what's interesting is she actually had very clear, precise directives around the economic organization of the community. Because as we've seen throughout these basic income debates, the economy really underlies so much of our social relations, of our relations with the environment, even of our politics, as we've seen. And so she had a few key principles, and I'm not going to explain to you the whole socioeconomic organization of Orville, but just highlight a few points. One is that there should be no private property. It's in the Marxist sense, no private property. And so all of our immovable assets, so all of our buildings, including housing, including my own house in Orville, is actually is held in trust by the community at large. So there's no ownership. This is the same for our businesses. So I might set up a business in Orville, I might run a business, but the business doesn't belong to me. Its revenues ultimately don't belong to me. I can't sell it and get the profit from that. So that was one key principle. The other is that everybody would actually participate in the society. So of all ages, there would be a form of participation. Because it was a project to actually elaborate a new society. And in return, and this is where the basic income starts to come in return, the community would commit to meeting the basic needs of all of its residents, of all of its community members. And today, the community meets these, more or less, but the ways in which it meets these are two. One is so we have a communal budget that's funded largely by our own enterprises, but also by some donations from the government of India, and including Indian and foreign donations, private donations. And this communal budget finances community services. And I don't mean just your basic community services like health and schools. It's a very wide ranges of services that are considered to help in actually living a much fuller life. So this includes adult education, we have public services that are basically yoga studios, dance studios, so anyone can go and take these classes for free. All of our public performance, cultural performances, all of this are also completely funded and free. I think I used to live in the Bay Area, and I think it's really interesting to consider this when, if you want to go to the opera or the ballet in San Francisco, you're looking at spending $200. So if you have this kind of whole public cultural life that's free, it creates a whole new level of kind of public learning and erudition. So that's one aspect of these institutions that actually meet the basic and beyond even development or personal development needs of Orwellians. And then we have a maintenance, what we call a maintenance, which seems to me to essentially be a form of conditional basic income. So our maintenance consists of 3 different packages, let's say. So one is cash, so in Indian rupees, that you can use, of course, anywhere outside of Orwell, including inside of Orwell. The other is what we call in kind, but it's not what you call in kind. So what we call in kind is basically a kind of like a local currency. So it is a value amount in rupees, but you can only use it within the community. So it achieves the same thing as a local currency, strengthening our communal economy. And then in addition to this, we have a few what you call in-kind provisions, which is their target, their specific. So for example, the health, so it covers your health fund, it covers lunches, and a general community contribution. Now, in order to be awarded this maintenance, you have to be working in Orwell, typically, okay? So in that sense, it's conditional, it's not unconditional. It's also, in a way, means-tested, but it's subjectively means-tested. So if I go and I say, I feel that I need a maintenance, no one's going to check, oh, do you have a bank account in Europe and how much money do you have in that bank account? And no, actually, you have the means to survive without the maintenance and therefore you won't be awarded it. So it's subjective. It's based on the perception of the Orwellian and their perceptions of their needs.
So I would like to ask then the other 2 participants then to reflect on the following question. So, and so the theme of our whole session, as it was formulated, is the emancipatory potential. What forms of freedom and what kind of community life does basic income promote? So here we had, I think, a very instructive presentation of an initiative which, unlike many, has now been going on for decades. That has a way of conceiving the emancipatory potential and also ideal community life in a way that's somewhat different from what one naturally has, spontaneously has in mind when thinking about a basic income society. And so has been very didactically presented by Surya Mie. And so there is something like a basic income in kind that is universal, but with some sort of opt-out possibility. There is a basic income in a universal income, basic income also in cash, in these 2 forms, local and in rupees. But the whole thing is conditioned by an active participation in the community, which can be activities within the community, and then for some people also activity that consists in services provided through businesses owned by the community to the outside world. So isn't that much better than basic income for the sake of emancipation?
So my initial thought is that we should see Oroville and basic income as complementary rather than as alternatives. So if we're going to explore this question of is Oroville an alternative to basic income, then we have to think about how we would scale up Oroville from one community of 3,000 people to something like a nation or a globe. And I think of two sort of models of how that might work. One would be that we'd have a nation or a world full of lots of Orovilles, so lots of communities with 3,000 or so people. Trying to get to that ideal, I think, though, risks compromising the Oroville philosophy, because I think it's very important to Oroville that people are there by choice, and trying to scale up in the way I've just described might involve compromising that sort of freedom of association. The other way of trying to scale things up would be to say, well, let's take the state and the nation or a global state, and let's try and arrange that on the same principles as Oroville. Then I think what we'd be looking at would be something like a socialist or a left social democratic state, but it would have this quality of a work test for income support. And then I think a lot of the anxieties and concerns that basic income advocates have about work tests would apply. It may be that in a small community, relatively small community of 3,000 people, you can get a work test to operate in a relatively humane and fair way, perhaps, but I think it's another question as to whether you can scale that up to a nation state, a bigger community. I think we have a lot of evidence that work tests typically or frequently don't work in fair and humane ways when they're at that level. So I think basic income and Oroville are best seen as complements. Oroville, I think, is an admirable ideal of how we might choose to associate with one another. Basic income, I think, is part of the background institutions secured by the state to help protect that freedom of association, in particular to protect our effective freedom to exit associations by giving us this independent income.
Yo-sang, please.
Yeah. Surya Mie, thank you for explaining history, nature, and life of Oroville. And as Philip said, regarding this question, as Philip said, we should distinguish a small-scale voluntary community, even though she said it is the largest international community, from a larger society in which we live normal lives. I think the voluntary community is built on the premise that there are autonomous individuals and they literally voluntarily choose to belong to a community, to obey its rules to achieve certain goals, for example, human progress or a higher life. In this case, we may admit that even a few tests, the income test plus a kind of set of basic services could give material foundation for such a life. But I don't think the principle regulating a voluntary community could be generalized in a larger society. Because basic income advocates, including me, argue that unconditionality of basic income could be emancipatory because it gives everyone a kind of autonomy. In this case, we admit that we now live in a society more or less patriarchal and hierarchical, and basic income could empower those who are in lower status in the system. So I think the basic income is a way to, there's such a condition where everyone could choose to build a kind of voluntary community if they want. So hence what I want to highlight is voluntarily. If we need basic income, universal, unconditional, and individually, it is because we live in a society which repress our ability to do something voluntarily. So it's my question. And next, now I'm going to comment on the basic services. Yeah. Most basic advocates don't intend to substitute whole social services with basic income, as you may know. We need some social services, for example, healthcare and education. So I think that recent controversies over UBI versus UBS is a kind of fake debate. We should distinguish and determine what would provide it in cash and what would provide in kind or in service. So I want to, Surya Mie, talk about what you mean by basic services in Oroville. Thank you.
So if you could react and still then, I mean, there are converging comments here on the, but, and perhaps you'll agree a bit too easily with them, but nevertheless, I would, in your response, perhaps, nevertheless, think about the question of what there might be to be learned from the Oroville experience for the introduction of a basic income on the level of a whole society. Because even though a part of this sort of basic income is given in cash, the maintenance with its various, at least two of its aspects are in cash. Nevertheless, probably if you look at the amount of resources that are distributed in cash versus in kind in the form of services, including what you said, lifelong learning, culture, etc., there is a significant discrepancy between Oroville and the standard view about basic income with the sort of presumption in favor of cash. So you've lived in Oroville for a large part, most of your life so far. You've been sort of interacting all the time with people who've been there for much longer than you. So in that light, what sort of enlightenment can you provide us?
Thank you. Thank you so much for those questions and responses. Philippe did ask me to stay on the kind of challenging line a little bit, you know, because I can bring this outer perspective. So do forgive me. But one thing that I would say is when I think about UBI, I think that we do really need to consider the limitations of UBI in the predominantly capitalist context in which we live in today, right? In which a lot of basic services are commodified and are increasingly commodified, including housing. I mean, it's tragic, in my opinion. So if we think about UBI and the examples we've heard, it's small amounts. So in this increasingly kind of rapacious capitalist context, how much more is that small amount really going to make a difference? And how does that actually fundamentally change the economic organization in which we live and which causes all of these problems that we have: environmental degradation, rising inequality, poverty. And so that's where I think that if you look at the kind of UBS, in a way, model, right, that Oroville is working on, is it takes so many, not just basic services, but even beyond. So the examples I highlighted, Hyosang, like, for example, cultural life, outside of this profit-making sphere of capitalism. And that creates, in an everyday life, it just makes such a huge difference. I can tell you from experience that you don't feel like immediately I need to think about how much does this cost, how much does that cost, and I'm burdened with all this individual financial decision making, which is still the case with UBI. And what's interesting is I hear a lot of Orovillians tell me that one of the things that they feel is so freeing for them is when they go to these and use these services that they don't need to think, how much do I cost? How much does this cost? How much do I pay for it? Do I use this instead of that? Because they're publicly funded. And so that individuated exchange is just eliminated from these aspects of our system. And I want to emphasize that we're not there yet. It's very much a work in progress, but we do already have the hints of this and the effects. Briefly, in terms of the question of scaling, I think we can think about it in two different ways. I mean, I think this model is not fundamentally different. I mean, you're from the Socialist Party. It's not fundamentally different, as Philippe already highlighted, from some existing ideas and actually practices. If you look at the Cuban model, it's not fundamentally all that different from the Cuban model as it exists today. And the other thing is that I would challenge this notion of development and of scale in this very Western, I have to say, conception of the nation state, right? Which is a relatively recent invention in terms of how we organize as community and as society. And being in India, if we think of the more Gandhian model of development, which was at the village basis, and which was at then associations of villages, then this is scalable in this very different way.
Okay, then I want to turn to a second question. There will be time for questions, but there is a second question that was circulated in advance to our three panelists and directly related to the theme we were asked to address. And Here it is. At the last the previous Bien Congress in Tampere, I was in charge of moderating a panel on experiments. And there were a number of people around the table, including Oli Kangas, who was already here, and also Sarat Davala, who is not in the room at the moment, but is there. Now listen to this, Sarat. One of the questions I asked the panel was the following. I said, you have all these pilots going on, all these experiments, and I asked the panel, is there anything that would come out of these panels that would convince you that, after all, basic income was not a good idea? And so panelists responded one after the other. So Oli Kangas said, well, if this and this was found out in the Finnish experiment, then I would have to concede, etc. Then came Sarat's turn. Could anything convince him? And he said, no, nothing. Whatever comes out of these experiments, of these pilots, there is nothing that could convince him that the idea was a bad idea. Now, this was regarded as puzzling by some people in the room, including initially myself. And, well, what's the point of doing all these experiments if you know in advance that it's going to be, that it is a good idea, whatever comes out of it. But, of course, if what is primary for your justification, for your own justification of basic income, is not the fact that it would increase employment, reduce the number of people who consume drugs, or whatever, take any particular effects, but if what's central is the emancipatory aspect, then if you have experiments that increase the level of social protection that exists at the time, or that make it more unconditional by dropping the household test, or dropping the means test, or dropping the work test. However, whether you do it radically or modestly, whatever you do, you increase the freedom of at least those who have least freedom. Because you may have to tax people, and thereby you may reduce their freedom, the freedom of the rich to make more money. But any of these experiments is then increasing the freedom of some of the people with least freedom. So we don't need to look whether they work more, they work less. We don't care. They have more choice. And so my question to you, and I start now with Stuart, and with, I have to always check with the more exotic names from my point of view, Yosang. So starting with you, and then I'll ask for your reaction. And so what's your own view? So if you have these experiments, and they show more employment, less employment, is this relevant for you after all? If it is relevant, why is that? Is that because you have a different conception of freedom? Or is it because you care and you think we should care about other things than freedom? Stuart.
Thank you. I think it is an empirical question, and in part that's because I think there are different notions of freedom or emancipation that are in play here. So let me put on the table a kind of rough and ready...
When you say it is an empirical question, you mean whether basic income is a good or bad idea?
Yeah, whether it's emancipatory. Okay, so let me put on the table a very rough and ready distinction between options freedom and what I'll call relationship freedom. So options freedom is the idea that you are more free the more options you have. And so if we increase the generosity of a benefit, if we reduce its conditionality, we're increasing people's options. And so in that sense, people are unambiguously necessarily freer. But relationship freedom is a more explicitly relational ideal. It's about how far our relationships with others are characterized by domination, the power of other people to interfere at their will in how we live, oppression. So it's a form of freedom that, in a way, has a kind of close relationship to notions of equality and status. And so we then have to ask the question, how are options freedom and relationship freedom related? And very often they go together in a very, very complementary way. And a lot of the stories we've had, very compelling stories and testimony from Dennis and others about the effects of basic income in experiments, it sees these two things going together. There's an increase in people's options, and they use that in ways that then impact back on their relationships. You know, they have more options, they make investments, they do new things, and that changes the way they relate to others. They're less subject to domination or oppression. But these two things can come apart, and when they come apart, basic income advocates, at least in some cases, think perhaps that we should give priority to relationship freedom over options freedom. And let me give what I think is the main example of this. Say somebody gets a basic income and they want to turn it into a lump sum. They want to take their basic income, go to a bank, sign off all their future basic income payments in return for getting a large lump sum, a capital sum. Should a basic income recipient have that option to turn their basic income into a lump sum? Well, many basic income advocates will say no, at least not to a complete extent. There should be a limitation on that option. And I think one possible reason for that is that there's a concern that if people turn their basic income into a lump sum, they might then lose the lump sum, and that will then compromise their relationship freedom. It will make them more vulnerable to domination and oppression by others. So I think what we're then saying is that it does matter how option freedom and relationship freedom interact, and that's an empirical question. And so I don't think we can settle the question in a purely kind of a priori philosophical way. We do have to look at the experimental evidence on how basic income is affecting what I'm calling, in a very rough and ready way, relationship freedom.
But that means that if you have an experiment that increases either the level of the benefit or reduces the conditionality of the benefit, if there is no reason to believe that there is some sort of discrepancy between options freedom and relational freedom in this case, then you would say, well, no need to look at other effects. Whatever people do with their money, providing they don't turn it into an endowment, all this is fine.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say that. So I mean, what one thing that I think matters is how options freedom and relationship freedom interact with each other. But at the end of the day, I'm a pluralist about values, so I also care about welfare and you know, how well people are doing in life independently of their options freedom. So in principle, if there was a case where increasing people's options led on average to much lower levels of welfare, then that's something that might lead me to support a restriction on options freedom for paternalist reasons.
And what would be a concrete example of a divergence there? Because of course there could be an argument that people are the best judges of their own welfare. Give them the choice, that choose.
And in general, I think that's a very good, strong presumption to work from. But paternalist legislation, so for example, legislation we have in the UK that requires you to wear a seatbelt when you drive a car, that's taking away an option in the interests of people's welfare. I think some paternalist legislation is justified, and so possibly there might be paternalist reasons for conditionality. I'm sceptical that the empirics will bear that out, but it is an empirical question for me.
And that could justify in-kind benefits rather than cash benefits, because then on paternalistic. Okay, you're saying.
Thank you. First of all, I think basic income is emancipatory. Yeah, as you said. To answer to the question, is emancipation all that counts? I want to change the question to what is the goal of basic income. From my own experience of left political activist, as you know, and lessons from the human experience in the 20th century, which ended with catastrophes. Basic income is above all about social justice. Here, I consider social justice in two senses. Firstly, social justice is a matter of guaranteeing everyone a good life, starting from economic security as well as physical security. And secondly, social justice is to give each people their own share. I derive this argument from the historical experience rather than reasoning, as I said earlier. In this vein, emancipation or freedom is a part of social justice or a way to promote social justice. So I don't think the emancipation is all that counts. In this case, we can draw with the goal of basic income from two instances. On the one hand, basic income is the best way to promote social justice by providing economic security to all. And on the other hand, basic income is a proper way to everyone their own share if we regard the basic income as giving everyone their share, which they have a right to their share in the Commonwealth. So, yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, so in your case, then again, you would side with Sarat in the sense that you are not interested in looking at the consequence. You say, well, these people are just getting their share, their fair share. And it is a fair share that at the same time provides them with some basic security, which then could, of course, be related to some sort of notion of freedom, because if you want to have some sort of substantive freedom, then you need at least to have this basic security. And so that would be on that. Whereas, in a sense, you are a pluralist because you attach importance to this idea of an equal share of what we inherited, something like that. And but at the same time, you care about this basic security itself, and the two go together in this case. And whereas in the case of Stuart, they said, well, I care about other things, which is I'll go and look at whether or not people are made happier or have a higher welfare defined in a certain way. Freedom is not, emancipation is not all that matters. So what do you make of all that?
Thank you. Well, is financial emancipation all that counts? You know, in a lot of the pilots that we've, heard about, the basic income pilots, they've been very focused on low income to no income recipients. And I really thank, I see some of you here, Jesse and Dennis, I really thank you for sharing your stories with us. And it's very clear to me that there, are strong emancipatory aspects to receiving this basic income. But when we talk about UBI, when I hear you all talk about UBI, you talk about UBI for all, it's not means tested, right? So for all social economic classes of society. And coming back to the sort of more capitalist critique, what we see in middle to high income earners with higher rates of consumption, we often see that these higher rates of consumption are actually linked to lower perceptions of quality of life. And in addition to this, there's all the costs to the environment. So I think that if we're thinking more broadly beyond just the low-income spectrum, so in here I'm aligning more with Stuart, I think we need to think beyond just these economic and financial measures in terms of what is it that really makes us feel free as humans, as human beings. And I think that Orville, begins to answer those questions by actually developing emancipatory pedagogies, emancipatory forms and participatory forms of political organization. So this much broader kind of utopian reformulation of society that allows for that access and development.
Yeah, because we may be made unfree by the lack of resources, but also by ambitions or sort of consumerist drives that enslave us in the end. And you are saying, well, emancipation is not just a matter of money. And okay, so instead of further discussing among the panel the other two questions I had thrown to them in advance, so let's open to the floor. Let's open the floor.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation, particularly Suri Maya telling us about Oro. It's very fascinating, Oroville. This is a question for Stuart on the question of whether or not it's advisable to restrict options for basic income recipients in the interest of greater welfare. Would you impose the same restrictions on people who have those options because of their own wealth and aren't dependent on the basic income for exercising those options?
Okay, we'll take 3 questions. So,
Anita Vincent from New Zealand. I wonder when decisions are made as to who gets these benefits, who makes the decisions? Is there a council or something like that? Can you just tell us a little bit about how that runs? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Peter Brake, also from New Zealand.
louder and into the microphone.
I have a question for the whole community. You mentioned the commodification of housing. Do you have an answer, or can you expand on how this could be applied to the rest of the world? And whether a child's lack of inheritance of a family home, in your experience in the community, is at all difficult?
Thank you so much for both of those questions. So I'll take them in order. So in terms of the budgeting, that's your question, how does the budgeting occur? So we do have a council. It's actually called the Budget Coordination Committee, the BCC. And the way it's constituted is it's representative members of various areas of community life. So there'll be members of an education subgroup, members of a farm and forest subgroup, members, so like that. So basically a classic kind of, when you scale these anarchist models of decision making, this is typically how it happens. You have representatives from a subgroup that go up to the next group. And then they, through a consensus decision making process, make the decisions as to how the budget is attributed to these services. Yes, the question as to housing, I don't know that the Orville model can be scaled, but essentially, as I mentioned earlier, there's no private property. So that, and this includes the houses. So this goes beyond the Marxist, definition of private property, because housing is typically considered personal property in the Marxist division. So for us, all these immovable assets, including housing, are held in trust by the community at large. So if someone were to leave the community, basically we have a housing service that takes care of reallocating our housing assets within the community. So that might, in some cases, account for if someone doesn't have an inheritance of house. Actually, our houses typically don't or are not supposed to go down by inheritance. It does often happen in practice, I'll be honest. But strictly speaking, in terms of how our system is organized, we do have a body, the housing service, that would decide on that reallocation of the housing based on the housing needs of the community.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I really want to be careful about saying there is in the real world a paternalist justification for welfare conditionality. So I think all I want to say is that if we had evidence that a conditional program had some beneficial effects relative to an unconditional one, that would be a consideration in favor of conditionality. But I really think we have to evaluate these things in an all things considered way. And another factor, another consideration that we'd have to bring in is very much the consideration of, well, are we treating citizens equitably? Are we putting the same restrictions on options to all citizens? And that I think is a very weighty consideration, and we might then reasonably decide, well, even if a conditional program has an advantage in welfare terms, that's offset by the fact that it's inequitable. It may also be empirically that that very inequity undermines the paternalist effectiveness of the policy. So all I'm trying to say is, I think it's an empirical question. an advantage that conditionality might potentially have would be something we'd have to factor into this all things considered analysis.
Of course, some of the paternalistic arguments can still be ultimately freedom-based. That is, you protect people against their immediate choices that may be short-sighted in order to protect their future freedom. And so that's often the former paternalistic arguments say. Now,
Yeah.
there was a hand raised even in the course of the first part of the discussion, so that can have priority.
So my first question to Surya, is that I just wanted to know, you are 3,000 as a community and 28 square kilometers. That's something that I got the figures from you. And but there is a 1.3 billion people living, living in that particular. So it's really an oasis. Now the question that I have for you is, what is it in the construction of Oroville that keeps people out? I mean, if Oroville is certainly having that kind of emancipation or level of freedom, then what is it that firewalls you from just getting inundated by applicants who want to become Orovillians? So this is a very important question for me, because it's the similar kind of situation we have back in Sikkim. We are just 600,000 people, 6 lakh people, that is, so therefore it does, we have other, ways in which people from other parts of India, say, can't buy land and so on and so forth. The question on upscaling, or, is there any, therefore, some academic research that has been done to understand if there can be some level of upscaling which can happen? Okay, so that's the other question. If these are the two questions, I'd be very happy if you can tackle. Thank you.
Mine would be with my. You can refuse to answer, Surya Mani, because it might be quite personal. But I wanted to hear what makes you, what enabled you to be what you are and to do things you want to do that you couldn't get anywhere else in the world.
Thank you. My name is Danbi. I also grew up in Oroville, so child of Oroville. I'm currently a researcher at the Technical University of Munich. A question to Surya Mani, something that I thought a lot about since I returned to Oroville a couple of times earlier this year. So Oroville is largely dependent on external funding, right? So whether it be from the government of India or from other organizations or Oroville international groups that raises these funds. So how do you think we could be more self-sufficient as a community to provide these universal basic services or income for the community? Because one of the main criticisms about Oroville from an economic point of view is that it's not self-sufficient yet, whether it be food-wise or actually like the products that we need to sustain ourselves. So yeah, if you could answer that. And also just to touch upon what you asked about what a difference it made to grow up in Oroville. I think for me personally, I know I don't want to hog up too much time, but I think growing up in Oroville, I didn't tie my identity to my cultural background. So it wasn't Danbi from Korea, but it was Danbi from just, I was my own individual. And that kind of liberation and freedom gave me so much to just pursue my interests without any apology or duty to my own country or to my nation or to my culture. So that kind of liberation, I think, should be given to every single child. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Okay. Thank you for all of those questions. So some of them I can actually answer a little bit together, PD Rai and Danbe, on the funding specifically. So PD Rai, you said, Oroville is an oasis. It's not a utopia to everyone, I think that's when we conceptualize utopia, I think that's one of the big issues actually around utopianism is utopia is understood, and Stuart can maybe contribute on this later, is there's kind of a singular idea put forward as to what a utopia is, And I think that's very wrong. There is no singular idea of what a utopia is. A utopia for me is different than a utopia for you, potentially. And so it's not the case that we have hordes of people wanting to join the community and that we have to push away, actually. We do have an entry process for people who do want to join the community, and I haven't actually sat ever on that committee, so I can't speak to it from the inside. But I know that, basic questions that are asked about why they want to join relate to what is their connection with the founding ideals of this community? Are they really prepared to participate in this experiment? And let me tell you, the other thing about utopia is we tend to think that it's all rosy. And utopia is actually my area of expertise, not basic income. And what I can say is when we look at all the empirical ethnographic literature on utopian practice is very difficult. Utopian practice is waking up every morning in the face of very high ideals and failing to reach them. And that's tough to live with day in, day out. So it's not the case that so many people actually want to join us. And related to the surrounding population, we have a population of 3,000 people that are currently community members. Within that population, 50% are Indian. And of that Indian contingency, the vast majority of that Indian contingency is actually local Tamilians. So they are integrated into there are local Tamilians that choose to join the community. This relates also, Danbe, to your question about the external funding. So the majority of the funding for our community does come from within our community. I have recent figures and I can show them to you. Interestingly, the amounts that come from outside, that come from the government of India, that come from foreign and Indian donations, a lot of that, if you look at the figures, a lot of that is going to bioregional development. So a lot of that is actually going to non-profits, Orville's non-profits, whose beneficiaries are not Orvillians, but whose beneficiaries are the local population. So I think when we think of those figures, we need to look really clearly at the disbursement and where they're going.
So what's an example of that, of then services? So you use some of these resources that come from the outside to provide services on a non-profit basis to the surrounding communities. What would be an example of that? Yeah, so we have a NGO called Village Action that's been existing for many years, that does a lot of particularly women's empowerment in the local bioregion. And so often donations will actually not go directly to Orville, but will go specifically to our Orville nonprofits. But within our economy, when you look at it, it just says going to Orville if you just look at the first figures. There was also the question of, and thank you for that question, our friend from Australia. What is it that was different for me growing up in Orville that I couldn't have had anywhere else in the world? I recently analyzed and wrote up a survey of people who had grown up in Orville from the very beginning up until, I think it was 2013 was the end of the questionnaire. And one of the things that people highlighted were, one, the intergenerational social fabric of our community that was so strong, the multiculturalism that was really strong. And this speaks to me particularly is we had this very unique pedagogical program called Awareness Through the Body that really enabled us to explore how do we develop as humans, not just intellectually, but in all of these different parts of our being. How do I relate to my emotional body, as we call it? How do I relate to my physical body? How do all of these parts of my being interconnect, and how do I become a more wholesome individual as a result? And that I've taken to me in every aspect of my life. So we are nearly at the end of our time, so I would invite one last question, but not on Oroville. So on the general issue then of, it can be related to Oroville, but rather directed to one of our other panelists, if there is such a question.
Yes, I want to know more difference between, you can say, UBS and UBI. What kind of social security there is in Oroville, if there are any, and basic income is like also one very important aspect is that you can say no. You have the freedom to say no. Is that freedom taken care of in Oroville? It's just to see the difference between these two more clearly.
Okay. It's cheating a bit because it's still about Oroville, but then there is, of course, an important difference that came up from the beginning. If you say no to the sort of labor type participation in Oroville, you can say no, but then you are out, right? Because then it means you are not conforming to the conditions that were accepted when you become a member of Oroville. So perhaps can let the other two speakers react on whether they really find this important to be able to say no to the obligation to work, essentially. And then I let Suryanami still have the last word in defense of Oroville.
Well, I guess that freedom to say freedom to say no is very important to that what I was calling relationship freedom. You know, I think the thing that's very significant about basic income potentially is the way it improves people's ability to exit relationships and the way that then impacts back on the quality of those relationships, whether it be with an employer or with a spouse or friends or a bureaucrat. So yeah, I do think that's important. I mean, one issue which I think has come up in the discussion, which maybe needs more interrogation, is the debate that's certainly emerging in the UK, where basic income and universal basic services are being presented as alternatives, and I think you were saying that we shouldn't think of them as alternatives. In the UK, some people on the left are sort of presenting it like that, and there is a kind of issue there, I think, for the basic income movement in explaining what it is that basic income does that's distinctive in relation to basic services, and it may be that this power to say no is part of that.
Okay, so yeah. In particular, so what happens if someone says, no, I'm not doing my share of the community work? And the person doesn't say I'm sick, etc. I'm just saying no. I want to free ride. Then you ostracize that person? Do you sort of just frown a little bit, or do you say, sorry, your place is not here?
So as I said earlier, I could only highlight a few aspects of Orwell's socioeconomic system at the beginning, but at the risk of opening a much larger debate, I'll try to keep it short. So it's not only that you can receive a maintenance through our services system if you work in the services. There are a lot of Orwellians who set up social enterprises or enterprises in Orwell. So they create their own income-generating enterprises, which are owned by the community, but from which they draw their own maintenance. So you absolutely have the choice to do that. There are also people who have their own funds, who might have joined the community at 40, 50, might have had funding. They're not asked to give up their funds to the community. And we have people who live on those funds. And some of them choose to work, to greater or lesser extents. And so it's not the case that you have, there is a lot more freedom than the picture I painted earlier.
Okay. Thank you very much to you and to the other panelists. This was really, I think, very stimulating stuff. So in a sense, a basic income society is a utopia, and through reflecting on small-scale utopias is something that is always good food for thought in the relationship. Okay, now I have to grab Sarat. I have to ask a guy to join us, and
if I can just make one quick comment, there are a few other Orwellians in the room, so those Orwellians who are willing to be approached for questions, if you could wave so people know who you are. So look at the people waving. So if you have further questions about Orwell, feel free to grab any of these people, okay, in addition to myself after the talk. Thank you.
Friends, I have to apologize to start with for speaking again this morning. We planned this at an earlier time. I think all of you are aware that a certain gentleman, comrade, brother, whatever you wish to call him, has been doing a fantastic job organizing this Congress. And And it's been a long journey to get to this Congress. And we're having this a little event here because several of the people have to leave before this afternoon. But it's not been an easy journey. Sarath has proved to be exploitative, oppressive, compulsive, intensive. A lot of other words come to mind, but it's to his credit that he's mobilized not only an international advisory board and taken absolutely no notice of everything we've tried to say, which is probably why it's been a success, but also he's mobilized the whole of his family. And I think it's important, before we thank him with a little gesture, to acknowledge that Vasudha, for example, where is she? Where is she? No, she's not. Where is she? Please stand up. Vasudha and definitely the and Hannah, where is Hannah? Hannah, please stand up, have been really doing a fantastic job behind the scenes. I should just say in passing that it's cost me a lot in chocolate cake for a certain member of the family, but that will be, we'll talk about that later. And also Ravi and Suma have been doing, Ravi's Sarath's brother, as you know. And I think that I can look back at this period where I promise you, we have exchanged thousands of emails, numerous Skype discussions, and numerous meetings. I noticed that we've had meetings in Delhi, London, Oslo, and Nice, the south of France. You see what planning an international Congress involves. But with those words, let me congratulate Sarath, thank him extraordinarily for his work. And Renana will present a little gift. Sheikha Ben will say a few words, and I'm very pleased to see her back in good health. She will say a few words as well.
Thank you, Goy Bhai. Good morning, everybody. It's not easy to talk for my colleague on behalf of Seva family, Sharad Dawla. Usually I'm tell him Sharad Bhai, so I've used Sharad Bhai here. He was dedicated his life from last 25 years for the poor people in India as a sociologist, as a researcher, and also closely worked with the Seva family in the state of Madhya Pradesh with me and Renana Ben in lots of the campaign, and did the research and surveys on issues of the informal sector worker. When we did the basic income pilot in India, he was one who took care of all the research study and promote the basic income in India. After this research, interest in basic income in India established the INBI, that is India Network for Basic Income, mobilized the people such as the researcher, the media person, the leaders, the politicians, the academic in that network. I am very honored and glad that the Sharad Bhai is with us. When we launched the campaign in India to demand the basic income, he initiated that campaign, strategy, the campaign material, and so many things. It is not possible to explain here. So thank you, Sharad Bhai, for being with us to promote the basic income, not only in India, and he travels a lot in lots of the countries to promote our basic income pilot study. Thank you, Sharad Bhai.
Can I have a... Yeah. So I first met Sarath at one of the previous congresses. I heard him speak a couple of times, and I said, wow, this is the sort of guy who we really need in our network. One, he's committed. 2, he's bright, he makes good points at the right time. 3, he doesn't have a big ego, he's self-effacing, and he's able to listen to other people. So this is the sort of people we need. And then he came and got more involved in the network. I voted for him enthusiastically as a vice chair of Bien. And then there was the organization of this conference. I couldn't understand how he did it. Sort of, in 3 minutes, you ask him a complicated question about visa application and getting permission from ministry and so on, and 3 minutes later, you get the thing in attachment, all the documents you need, and you go to the consulate in your country, and they're all very impressed by the fact that you are so well prepared. And I said, how does he manage? And I came here, and I discovered a secret. The secret is sitting in the room, because it's not only that you need a tolerant partner and a tolerant child, you need a wife, you need a spouse, you need a child that maybe, not, he's suggesting an exploited wife. No, a self-exploiting wife. That is, someone who's equally committed to these objectives, to these values, and who is willing to put up with someone as committed, as engaged, as busy as Sarat. But, I mean, I can understand them two there because he's also such a nice guy. Thank you, Sarat.
Malcolm Torrey, General Manager of Bien. I work with the Executive Committee, and all I want to say is that Sarath has managed brilliantly to balance being Vice Chair of Bien and organising the whole of this conference. So thank you, Sarath.
We would like, on behalf of Bien and the Seva family, to present this certificate, which is up there. Where is it? Tech. But I would like to read it to you. It's an appreciation. This is an expression of our respect and appreciation for Dr. Sarat Dhawla, who brought basic income to India. An important participant in piloting basic income, he established the Indian Network for Basic Income and organized the 19th Bien Congress in Hyderabad in August 2019, all in the cause of advancing social justice, economic security, and personal freedom. Sharat. This is not enough. So we have a little statue, and can you put it up, please, on the screen, of people reaching for the stars.
Thank you so much. Please don't go away. Now I'm changing my hat. I'm not a host now. I'm on behalf of Bien. We would like to honor 4 Indians for their contribution, not 4 persons for their contribution to the Indian discourse. Renana Jabwala, Shikha Joshi, and Guy Standing. And I request Mr. P.D. Rai come onto the stage. We would like to acknowledge their contribution. May I request Almaz to come and honor Renana Ben. May I request Caroline? Is Caroline here? Dennis is here. Dennis, please come and honor Guy standing. Hyosung is here. Hyosung, please honor Shikha Joshi. give it, Guy standing. And I request Surya Mie to honor Mr. P.D. Rai. Each of them have really, at a very strategic moments, with strategic interventions, they have created what we see today as a very interesting and fascinating India basic income story.
I want to introduce the Ravi Davla, elder brother of Sharad Bhai. Younger brother of Sharad Bhai. You already watched the video. He prepared that video, so I want also acknowledge and honor the Ravi Bhai here.